Hello, and bienvenidos to this episode of Voces, the official Hola at IBM podcast that brings our Hispanic and Latino communities of IBM together to share authentic, accessible, and informal conversations, amplifying critical leadership messages on culture, career, well-being, business, and technology. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of IBM.
Welcome to today's episode, where I have the absolute pleasure of introducing someone whose voice and vision have made waves in the world of storytelling and self-discovery, Monica Rivera. A first-generation Latina from New York City, Monica is a speaker, marketing strategist, business coach, and reformed self-doubter. After spending 15 years in marketing for prominent companies like SAP, Deloitte, Verizon, and Citi, she went and took a bold step to launch You Want to Do What? A coaching consultancy dedicated to helping business professionals become thought leaders. What's even more special about today's conversation is the personal connection Monica and I have formed through our stories in the 5th volume of the Hispanic Rising Star book. When we read each other's story at the launch event, it was like holding up a mirror to my own experiences. Navigating between two worlds, balancing identity and confronting fear head-on, her journey resonated deeply within me, and from that resonance, a bond was created. In our journeys, Monica and I have discovered that fear is not an endpoint, but a doorway to growth. Each moment we faced our fears became a stepping stone, reminding us that on the other side of the uncertainty lies strength, resilience, and the chance to fully embrace our true selves. It's in these shared struggles that we find common ground, turning our vulnerabilities into our greatest sources of power. This episode is an invitation, not just into our lives, but into a shared experience of finding strength in vulnerability and connection in our stories. We hope you'll find inspiration and empowerment in our conversation as we dive into the lessons that shaped us. Let's get started. Welcome, Monica. Thank you for joining me. I'm excited to chat with you about our shared experience participating in Volume 5 of the Hispanic Stars Rising. I do want to make sure that you have an ample opportunity to talk, but one of the things that I do want to briefly note is I'd like to have a conversation with you about our shared experience. We were able to participate in the launch event yesterday, which was amazing. And you read my story, I read your story, and the connections that we found both after we finally met each other and in reading the story were just purely out of the stars. I wanted to ask you, what did you think when you first read the story? Did you find similar connection points within reading the story yourself?
Oh, absolutely. So one, I just want to say it was an honor to read your story. And I was really surprised at the similarities that we have. So I'm Puerto Rican and Cubana. I'm raised in the Bronx. I know that you're Puerto Rican and Peruvian, raised in Brooklyn. And so that right off of the bat was a similarity that we both had with each other. My niece is Puerto Rican and Peruvian. She's my favorite human in the world. So I already knew that once I met you, I was going to love you even more. But then really reading the story about the connection with your father, I had the connection with my mother in the story. So for anyone who hasn't read it, I'll just give you a little bit of an excerpt. So I talk about, essentially the story is about being woken up in the middle of the night to a fire for the store that was downstairs, so the bodega that was in the corner store of my building, and having to go to school the next morning. And I grew up in the Bronx in a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood. I went to school in a predominantly white neighborhood, and what it looked like really to shapeshift between these two spaces of where I am entering a world that no one knows what happened just the night before, and how often as Latinas and as people of color, we often have to separate parts of ourselves when we go to work, when we go to school, and not really reveal all of that. So listening to me talk about my mother, and then you talk about your father, just again, it was the dynamics of just the family play, the neighborhood, the having to be someone else, and what are the lessons that we learn as children? How do we bring that into our professional lives and our adulthood? So there were so many different places that I found of connection between us.
That's amazing. And I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned during that specific topic around it, navigating two worlds. The parts in my story that were not probably evident is I also experienced very same thing. Growing up in a predominantly Black and Hispanic community, poor neighborhood in Brooklyn, and then taking the train to go to a predominantly Irish, Italian Catholic school where about 90% of the students were white or considered themselves to be, of that, heritage, and just trying to assimilate. So let me ask you this, because both of us have that in common. I saw that as, using my cultural identity was sometimes a little bit, you kind of put that on the back burner. How did you navigate that, going to school in that predominantly white private school, or public school shape? And how did that shape your identity? Like, how do you feel that actually worked against you or worked for you growing up?
So it's interesting. I've thought about this quite a bit throughout the years. So I also went to a Catholic school, and I remember it's everything about it. I liken it to, if anybody remembers Superman and Clark Kent going into the phone booth and changing clothes, that's sort of how I felt, because the way I dressed at home or on the block was entirely different than the red plaid school uniform that I wore every day to go to school. So there was this shift, not just in what I was wearing, but I think also how I showed up. So when I went to school, I was aware, obviously, that I'm Latina, and I was also aware that there were not many other Latinas in the school. And I knew that certain parents had biases and thoughts and things like that, but mostly I really didn't let it affect my academic life. I was always very ambitious. I was student council president. I was captain of the cheerleading team. I was co-editor of the yearbook. So at the time, I wasn't aware of the boxes that other people place or tried to place us in when I was a kid. I was still very ambitious. This is what I want to do. And I would go for all of those opportunities. It wasn't actually until later that I feel I wasn't always considered as Latin. And I say this in quotes, and I know we're on audio, but if you could see me, I have the air quotes. That's when I started to realize that the experience I had as almost a New Yorker and that New York City urban Hispanic experience was very different when I started to meet people of other cultures and other Latin cultures after later on when I went to college. So that was one piece of it, which is very different. I don't think we necessarily always talk about enough what that experience looks like within our own community, of how Latin do we feel on the scale and who really decides that. And the truth is there is no scale. It's just the perceived scale that other people might have for us or we may have for ourselves. And then later in corporate America, I was still, again, very ambitious, all of those things. But now I started to see in action where people had different perspectives of me, and where there would be microaggressions. I would be called spicy, or people would comment a little bit on my ambition or maybe my straightforwardness. And that's when I started to see that personally, there were other factors at play in my career, which were going to be important for me to learn how to navigate.
Oh my God, everything you said just actually just hit me like a brick. It's hilarious that you and I experienced such a close reality. I felt the same way. It was flat growing up, because you thought as a kid, your Latinidad is what you know from your parents, which already in both of our backgrounds, there's a duality there because we come from two different cultures within the Latin community. And then on top of that, just navigating into your neighborhood, realizing that there's more identities out there. And I remember experiencing, for the first time riding a bus, speaking with a Dominican woman and having a very hard time understanding her Spanish because it was a different bit of dialect. So realizing that's very different. I've got to bring that into my presence. And then again, going to school with more cultures that didn't look like me, coming into corporate America, same thing, being deemed as a little too spicy, a little too standoffish, a little bit too of that Brooklyn attitude that may not get me very far. But realizing that all of that is part of who I am, and I have to own that, right? So I love that you're saying all of that. But let me switch a little bit to our families. So, my father's guidance in my story taught me how to swim, right? I mean, he threw me in the water and it was like sink or swim, kid. But that's how he approached life, and that's how he wanted us to approach life. How did your relationship with your mom during the fire shape the way you lead your life now?
I think it was very early on that I already assumed a leadership role. So my mom is very panicked, and it's understandable. If you're woken up in the middle of the night with someone telling you that the building is on fire and you live above the store that's on fire, it is a very natural reaction to panic. So my mom her emotions were heightened. And I remember her just going back and forth, knowing that she needed to get dressed, but also her nervous system completely short-circuiting, if you will, at the time. And so she's going back and forth, and I'm instructing her, grab your clothes, put on some pants, open the fire escape gate. So if anybody's familiar with living in New York City, and especially if you lived in what we call a pre-war building, we had these really heavy gates that would go over the fire escape. Unfortunately, because there's crime in the neighborhood, and the fire escape could be a place where people could access getting into your home. So to combat that, we had these steel fire escape gates. And I remember at the time, I was only maybe 10, 11 years old at the time. And so reminding myself, like, I'm not strong enough to figure out how to do this gate on my own. So I know I need the support of my mom, but she can't get it together. So step by step, I was telling her what we needed to do in order to exit the apartment so we could go down the fire escape. And that really, to me, was a demonstration of my leadership. Also, I think how I disappear in a crisis. I'm very methodical. I don't let emotions get the better of me. I'm very systematic. And my mom, unfortunately, I'm sure she wishes she probably would have been able to handle it differently at the time, but unfortunately she couldn't. And so I think it was just a microcosm of eventually how I would have to lead in the rest of my family life. And later on, there were a lot of really tragic things, unfortunately, that did happen in my family, but it really developed me into the leader that I am today. And I also think the leader that I am in my business.
That's amazing. It's so funny how our formative years, especially growing up, I guess in New York, or you could be growing up as a first generation pretty much anywhere, American, right? But the fact that we take that responsibility on to guide our parents to some degree and ensure that, like, I remember the same things with my mom, maybe not in the situation that is as dire as trying to escape a fire, which is, unfathomable to me. But other things like helping her, trying to read a form for school, or trying to get her to understand why we needed to pay this bill on time. There were things that I recall just trying to take that moment to guide our parents through just the American life, right? Not to switch it up, but that kind of resonates a lot with me, what you experienced with your mom there. And leading your life at the forefront is kind of how you are, right? You end up being that person that will take charge of most of the things in your life. I still to this day help my sister, out with things that she's struggling with. And I'm the person that says, okay, you got to save this much in your bank account. You got to pull this out for the kids. And, I am a loving titi as well. I don't have kids of my own, and I have 6 nieces and nephews who I adore. And, I help guide them as well. My oldest niece is in college, so I'll help her not get into student debt. I'll make sure that the family is doing well, right? So, yeah, it's funny how in the very early stages of your life, you end up being kind of that leader in your family. So
Absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing that because again, I think about how that is demonstrated with my niece who's 6.5. I have another niece who's much older. And it's that same kind of thought of how am I going to guide? And also I think about it even with the people that I work with. So I work with a lot of first and only. So it's men and women, but first in their family to maybe do something, only person in corporate America that maybe looks like them or has their own sets of experiences. And I don't know if you've encountered this as well, but when we assume this leadership role as a child and through childhood, it can be very difficult for them to ask for help. And I don't know if you feel that way, but for me, I've had a hard time asking for help. And I notice the same thing with my clients because if we've been the help, it is hard to then ask for help. I'm just curious if you've experienced the same thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think as Latinos, we're known to keep our heads down, but asking for help in the positions that we've been in, yeah, that's not something that's very common or second nature to me. It only took me a moment of realization as I experienced a lot of turmoil in trying to get ahead in my corporate life that I said to myself, you know what? I need mentors. I need people to support my journey. I need people to network with and really talk to them and be candid and ask and put my arm out there and say, hey, I need some help. If not for just my professional journey, but maybe for things that I'm working on that I would like to really excel at. So it took me a really long time to get to that point where I could ask for help. Yeah, I completely resonate with that. Sure.
Yeah, and it's difficult. I remember my first manager, I was very fortunate when I graduated. I started working within banking, but it was marketing within the banking. And my manager was Latino. He was also Puerto Rican, which is very rare to come out of the gate and have a manager that you can already resonate with. And he was also from New York City. And he saw the Bronx edges. They were very sharp Bronx edges when I entered corporate America. And he was so patient because he saw, I think, a little glimpse of what I was capable of and where I wanted to go. And he really helped shape that and have really candid conversations with me about what he saw, what other people might be seeing, so that I could have a better understanding of how to navigate that. And unfortunately, I hadn't had another Latin manager since then, but it was so formative to spend the first 4.5 years of my career under his tutelage to really learn about some of those things that I don't know had I had a different manager, if I would have been as fortunate to have someone who really understood the complexities of who I was, but also the capabilities that existed.
Wow, that's lucky that you were able to find that. I've been blessed in corporate life to find, and I'm not going to say specifically Latinas or Latinos. It's been more so for me, women that have been, formative for me. I've had the amazing experience to work for some really phenomenal women, including, more recently. And it's everything the way that they speak, the way that they, kind of portray themselves and really put their confidence out there has given me the more courage to actually not mimic them, but, be really clear that I'm excited and happy in who I am, that I can bring that to light. And they have given me the space to do that, which is unbelievable, especially in the corporate America. Yeah. So let me ask you, switch it up a little bit, but not really, because it's kind of on the same theme. Assimilation and authenticity. We both experienced that exhaustion of trying to blend in, whether it be in corporate America or at your work. At what point did you realize that embracing your full identity was the way forward?
So it's interesting because there's so many things that happen along the way. And it's very rarely this one moment that causes the pivot to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the one thing that stands out most to me is I'd been working at an organization. Again, I was the only woman on the smaller team, and I was the only Latina. Also, of the bigger team, there were other women, of course. And I remember this one woman in particular would call me Maria. Every time she saw me, she would call me Maria. And again, only Latina. And I would correct her and say like, oh no, so-and-so, my name is Monica. She's like, oh my gosh, yep, I totally forgot. And then I would see her again. It'd be a few days later. Hey, Maria. And I thought, okay, this is intentional because it's not hard. You can remember an office full of everybody else's name. But when you see me, you automatically think that I'm Maria. Mm-hmm. And I think there was something about that feeling of just being fed up at that point. And it wasn't until I was very strategic about it. We were in the break room and the vice president, also a woman, was there. And she just made this remark, which is almost this alley-oop, which really gave me the opening to say something, and said, oh, so-and-so, you know Monica. And I said, I do know this person. It's so funny. You'll never believe it. She always calls me Maria. She can never remember my name. And in that moment, because the manager, the vice president at the time, was an Asian woman. And so she also got it. So without me having to be heavy-handed about it, I called it out. And that woman never called me Maria again.
You empowered yourself. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I had to say it in front of someone else because me saying it to her wasn't enough. But saying it in this way in front of this other woman, still polite, still professional, but calling it out, completely changed it. And at that point, I thought, you know what? I'm not going to keep changing the way that I dress. I'm not going to continue to straighten my hair. I'm not going to continue to hold my tongue for certain things because this one particular role had been a little tough and the culture of this one company had been a little tough. And I just said, I'm going to show up exactly how I am. And that was really the difference for me. And from there, I think it just changed the trajectory of my career.
That is a great story. I mean, I think our community has so many stories similar to that. But I love how you took the moment, you empowered yourself, and you put it out there, in a very tactful way, right? You didn't call somebody out specifically and chastise them. You made it you put it in that, I don't know how to say this, but a lot of us Bronx and Brooklyn people, we do this very tactfully without, but still what they would consider meanly, right? But
yes.
So it's great. I love it. Okay. So
and I just want to say, it's so funny you say that because they think that it's mean, but truthfully, how we would want to normally approach it, if we were back in the neighborhood, would look totally different than how we're actually doing it in the setting. But it's enough. Like sometimes people do need to be called out on it. And it's all about how you can do it. And as they say, communication is less about the words you use, but more about how you actually say it. And so I just made sure I said it in a way where everyone still felt comfortable, but they still got the point of what I was trying to convey. And she did.
I'm over here shaking my head. You can't see me, but yes, I am shaking my head. This is why I got to say this because I was listening to your podcast and there was an interview where you were speaking to someone. Actually, maybe it wasn't your podcast. It may have been another podcast, but you were being interviewed and you were talking about your title, the title of your podcast. And you mentioned how the host said it in a different way. I think he was from somewhere in the Midwest or maybe even Southwest. And you say, in New York, we say it so differently. And he had you say it. I'm like, that is so New York.
Yes, I love that you mentioned that. So the name of my podcast and also the name of my business is You Want to Do What? Mm-hmm. But when I first started this, which was back in 2017, it was You Want to Do What? With this little bit of an attitude and this edge to it, because truthfully, when I had this idea to do something different, it was a thought that was coming back to me, almost the voice that we all have in our own heads. But my voice was challenging me. You want to do what? This is crazy. Why would you do this? You have this nice career. Why are you going to take on all this other work and try something new? But yet, when I was speaking with the person who was interviewing me, who's actually a really good friend now, he lives in Ohio.
Okay. Yeah.
Really nice man. And he says it, you want to do what? With this excitement, almost like that's entertainment, in a totally different way. And so I joke about, wow, you must have been raised in such a healthy way where everything is so positive.
Yeah.
In New York, there's more of a challenge to it, and there's more of a bite to it. And the bite is the thought of how I think of it in my head. But I have softened throughout the years, which I guess is a good sign of growth. But I always find it really remarkable to hear how other people announce the name of the company in the podcast.
It was such a great moment. And please mention your friend's name because I feel bad that I just couldn't remember the name.
His name is Dave Jackson. Dave Jackson. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. So to Dave Jackson, that was such a great question because I loved it. I know I laughed for quite a minute in the car listening to it. So let's wrap up a little bit. Let me just ask one final question. In both the stories, we turned our moments of fear into resilience. What advice would you give to those struggling to navigate their own fires and their own oceans in life?
So I just want to pause for a second to just even think about that, like the fire and the ocean and those elements that are represented in our stories and how they're so opposite of each other. Yet here we are having this conversation and just, I want to appreciate how we're here in this space having this conversation. So I just wanted to really acknowledge that because I think it's a really beautiful thing of how our journeys sometimes feel very lonely or exclusive or somehow even sometimes ordinary to us because it's just one part of many things that we've maybe gone through or experienced, but how unifying they are when we truly tell them. So I just want to really acknowledge that. In terms of the advice that I would have for people, I say this often because it is extremely important. I hear this with my clients. I hear this when I go into corporations and I speak about people not always understanding why we might be doing something else or why we might be blazing a different trail. And so I would leave people with this. Not everyone has your vision, so don't let them block your view. And I'll just say that one more time. Not everyone has your vision, so don't let them block your view. If there is something that is a goal in your heart, a desire that you have, an ambition that you want to achieve, there will be a lot of people saying you want to do what and trying to really knock you down or get you to second guess or doubt the very thing you want to do. They don't have your vision. So continue to move forward with your view unobstructed.
I love it. Move those mountains from the mouth of Monica Rivera. Thank you, Monica, for joining us on Voces. I would encourage our audience to reflect on this conversation without fear, with full resilience and embracing our Latinidad, and remind you to check out Monica's podcast, You Want to Do What? And thank you again, Monica. And I love this conversation. I hope we can do this again. And if anything, we can meet up for coffee. So
I would love it. Absolutely. Right. Count me in. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Voces. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels. You can find us as Voces so you don't miss any new episodes.